Hi, my name is Shannon Knight, and this is a presentation about how to read the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. First, we need to understand how the Synoptic Gospels are related. The word synoptic is a Greek word that means seeing together. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they present a similar view of Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection. And in fact, they are so similar that many scholars believe they draw upon some of the same original sources. As you can see, most of Mark is included, sometimes word for word, in either Matthew or Luke or both. Matthew and Luke also have some material in common that is not in Mark. To determine why these commonalities exist, New Testament scholars use a process called source criticism, where they try to determine the sources that informed each of the texts. As a result of source criticism, there are different views on which gospel came first and who borrowed from whom. However, the majority of New Testament scholars today take the stance of Markan priority. This states that Mark was written first, and Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a source, but independently of one another. The two-source theory assumes Markan priority and claims that Matthew and Luke used another common source or sources that are long lost to us. This source is commonly known as Q, from a German word that means source. The four-source theory, an expansion on the two-source theory, holds that due to the unique content in Matthew and in Luke, that they each have their own unknown sources known as M for Matthew's unique source and L for Luke's unique source. Even though Markan priority is the most common stance right now, all source theories are theories. To read the Bible effectively, we need to consider contexts, including literary, cultural, and historical contexts, as well as audience, to determine what each author wishes to portray. Although other views exist, most historians now agree that the Synoptic Gospels are ancient biographies. Ancient biographies differ from modern biographies. Modern biographies are expected to be a comprehensive retelling of a person's life, whereas ancient biographies were much more selective in their material in order to highlight key achievements. This is because modern biographies aim to take an objective stance without judgment of the person's life, while ancient biographies were often written for moral purposes to provide information about a person that others should emulate. While modern biographies are usually written in chronological order, ancient biographies follow more basic chronological requirements. They are usually in order of birth, if known, then life, then death. Aside from this, events within the person's life could be out of order. In fact, it was much more common for them to follow a thematic order that brought up different parts of their life as they pertained to a specific topic. This means that even though Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote about many common events, they were not always written in the same order. This would have been seen as a normal way of writing in the first century biographies. While modern biographies tend to use exact quotes, ancient biographies are not expected to be verbatim. Some short proverb-like sayings are likely original words, but parables probably were not, even though they were expected to maintain the storyline and the main points. In comparison with other ancient biographies of the first century, the Gospels are considered highly reliable. The Gospels were written within living memory of Jesus' death, which is defined as within 60 to 80 years. This means that they were written at a time when many eyewitnesses and those who knew eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry, death, and resurrection were still alive. Therefore, the evidence would have needed to be highly accurate, well supported, and indisputable. Otherwise, those eyewitnesses who were still alive, many of them playing important roles in the early church, would have disputed the authenticity of the Gospels. When reading the Bible, before attempting to discover what it means for us today, it is important to first discover what it would have meant at that place and time and within the original culture. The parables and lessons Jesus taught in the New Testament were taught within the context of a culture that is very different from our own. This impacts the way they understood parables and lessons Jesus taught. For example, Jesus used many fishing and agricultural references, which would have been a common line of work for many people in the first century. We also need to consider the author as well as their audience when reading biblical texts. Matthew, who was a tax collector and one of the original 12 disciples, wrote his Gospels for a Jewish audience. As a result, his Old Testament quotations should be carefully analyzed as they are very purposeful and meaningful. Matthew focused on the fulfillment of the law and prophets, as well as purveying Jesus as the Messiah, King of the Jews, son of David, and son of Abraham. Mark was a companion of Peter, who was one of Jesus' original 12 disciples. Mark probably would have been a teenager when Jesus was in Jerusalem, and possibly had the opportunity to witness Jesus' teachings firsthand. His mother was one of the earliest disciples who gave up her home to become a meeting place for the early church. It is believed that Mark wrote much of his gospel directly from the eyewitness account of Peter. Mark wrote his gospel for the Romans and represents Jesus in ways that would likely have impressed the Romans. He emphasized Jesus as a worker of miracles and one with divine power. Mark's writing was considered more crude than that of other Gospels. If Matthew and Luke did borrow from Mark, as Mark and Priority suggests, they smoothed over the language and shortened it to make it more appropriate for their own audiences. Luke was a physician who left his work to become a companion of Paul, previously known as Saul the Pharisee. Luke would have had many opportunities to meet the disciples who knew Christ. Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, which are believed to have been written as a set and are written very carefully with correlating structures. Luke's audience were the Greeks. He represents Christ as a friend of humanity and a humane Savior.